possiamo iniziare. Benvenuti all'incontro con la ricerca di LEDS, e questo incontro è stato anche organizzato dal SISM, che è l'Associazione di Studenti di Medicina, e a dirigere la conferenza ci sarà il dottor Dasgupta, che è un ricercatore dell'Università Ca' Foscari di Venezia e lavora anche col CMCC, che è il Centro Mediterraneo sui cambiamenti climatici. Quindi lascio la parola a Dasgupta. Grazie.
Very kind. So, we'll put this here. Okay. So, I'd like to start by thanking all of you, especially LEDS and Ricardo, for arranging this. It's a great turnout, and it's always great to present to students, especially on topics that I not only work on, but I'm also very passionate about. So before we start, some ground rules. I teach statistics in Laurea, 150 students per class, okay, so I have a lot of patience. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and I will answer it right away, okay? Don't worry about breaking my rhythm or interrupting me. Remember, the only silly question is the one that you do not ask. I guarantee you, if you have a question, someone else also probably has that question, but they're maybe a little shy to ask it. So go forward and ask the question. It's very important. So, as Ricardo very kindly said, I work for two institutions, Università Ca' Foscari Venezia, where I am a research fellow and a lecturer. I teach statistics, data analysis, and econometrics, and impacts of climate change also. And I also work at Fondazione CMCC, where I work as an econometrician on the impacts of climate change on human health. That's what we'll talk about today, but also energy demand and energy supply, and labor. So I have a broad range of interests, and so does CMCC. Okay? So I was just telling Ricardo that we have 8 divisions. 6 of them are climatic modeling divisions, employing everyone from environmental engineers to energy engineers to doctors, and of course physicists and chemists, chemical engineers. The divisions I work for work with mostly economists and modelers, okay, or economic modelers. So we're always looking for students to work with, especially with thesis. If you have an interesting idea, interesting topic that you want to develop with us, work with us, just send me an email, and I guarantee you we'll find someone to supervise you or find you data. Okay? So, having said that, let's get into what we are here today for. Climate change and human health. As you can see that the topic or the title is a bit dramatic. Are we doomed? The short answer is yes, we are, because we are so bad at learning from history, right? We're still bickering about who will contribute to what, where the real question is how many people will die. Even more so, does climate change increase the probability of your early death? I'm an economist, so I'm a pessimist by nature. Furthermore, to make it worse, I'm an econometrician, so I have no intuition. I only look at numbers. And by that, what I mean is I love telling people that you are going to die faster, sooner, because of climate change. Okay? And this is the message sometimes we need to get through to the policymakers, because all they're interested in is how many people will die. Actually, what they're interested in is how many of my voters will die, right? So if we can get that number through them, they're more likely to act on climate change. Okay. So, and as you can probably already tell, I don't really care about being politically correct in the classroom. Okay? Let's get on with this. So, introduction. I hope there are medical students here, right? Yeah. Are there? Excellent, very good. So, in the last, let's say, 60 years, 6 decades, we have sent people to the moon, okay? But the greatest advancement in technology has actually come in the medical field, okay? We have dramatically improved or increased people's lifespans. We have eradicated multiple diseases, okay, in both developed and developing countries, okay? And we have actually learned to cure diseases over the last 6 decades. What climate change threatens to do is it threatens to undermine the last half a century of advancement in global or public health. This is the worst case scenario. Many diseases that we thought we had gotten rid of are going to come back. Okay, that's the re-emerging diseases. We're going to have new diseases that we probably don't know how to cure. Okay, that is the biggest fear. Furthermore, climate change will potentially affect many of the social and environmental determinants of health. One reason we have managed to advance with health is because we have educated people. Okay, we have improved women's empowerment. So some of those factors will actually also be eradicated due to climate change. I'll come to more into that later. Threats from climate change is not just due to temperature. Yes, we mostly talk about temperature, but threats from climate change comes in multiple forms. It's a multifaceted impact. Precipitation or extreme precipitation events, extreme temperature events, extreme weather, floods, deterioration of air quality, rising sea levels. You talk about it, Mother Nature will bring it to us. Okay? And all these effects will be transmitted by food, water, disease carriers such as mosquitoes, and of course our interaction with the natural environment. We are in environments now that we used to be not been before. We are in areas of Amazon. Let's talk about Amazon for a little bit. Now Brazil has unfortunately elected a president who thinks climate change is a Marxist plot. What we need to tell him is the great Karl Marx had many plots. Free public education, free healthcare, social security. Unfortunately, climate change was not on one of his plots. If it was, we probably would know more about it much faster. Between 2030 and 2050, we're expecting approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. Okay? That is just one number. We'll come more to that number in a little bit. As the climatic conditions continue to change, the risks to human health will only increase. And today, what I plan to do is give a comprehensive overview of the multifaceted impacts of climate change. I live in Venice today, so this morning we had rain, we had aqua alta, and we had very cold temperatures. Okay? So today's lecture, in effect, is brought to you by the letter C. C, remember, for climate change. Let's go. So, now, because I said climate change has multifaceted threats, okay, starting from temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, floods, and so on, we also need to talk a little bit about the pathways. Okay? Now, on top you will see, can you guys see at the back properly? I'll talk about it also. So climate drivers on top. How changes in climatic stressors, such as temperature and precipitation, go down. Okay? We have climatic drivers, then we have exposure pathways, the links, the routes that through which people are exposed to climate change, right? And then we have health outcomes, that is changes in risks or health status. On the left-hand side, we have the environmental or the institutional context. On the right-hand side, we have social or environmental context. I'll break this down in a little bit. So the center boxes represent climatic drivers. Then we have the primary pathways by which humans are exposed to health threats from these drivers. For example, increasing temperature means maybe more people are affected by flu. Extreme precipitation events may mean that disease carriers such as mosquitoes are increasing. Sea level rise or flooding may mean diseases like cholera or malaria coming back in areas that we don't have them anymore. And then of course at the bottom we have the health outcomes that we just talked about. On the two boxes, and the environmental and the institutional and the social and behavioral, those are the boxes that are supposed to check the risks of climate change. But what we now know is that climate change also deteriorates the social and the environmental contexts, okay, which is going to only increase the threat. I'm coming to all this in a detail. Okay, a bit more. So for a long time, in the climate change literature, we were only interested in GHG, the greenhouse gas emissions, right? But what we now know is what the relationship needs to be studied is GHG, climatic change, that is temperature, precipitation, and the other drivers, and the health linkage. So this is a very complicated diagram, but I'm happy to share this on the Facebook page, and also I'll send it to many of you or any of you who email it to me. But what essentially we're trying to show is we have GHG gas emissions on top, which results in extreme climatic events such as extreme temperature, extreme precipitation, flood and sea level rise. Let's talk about them, okay? And then one of them is ocean acidification on the left-hand side. Then you have temperature, flood, heat waves, drought, and fire, and then other pollutants. At the bottom, we have the diseases. Okay, so we have undernutrition, impact on mental health, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, and so on. So let's pick one. Let's say greenhouse gas emissions increases temperature. Increases in temperature may result in respiratory diseases increasing, okay? Or it may also increase in the incidence of fever among people, okay? Or let's talk about also again, move a little bit. Increasing temperature actually increases the lifespan of mosquitoes, especially mosquitoes that carry malaria. If malaria carrying mosquitoes are living for longer, then it means that they get to bite more people, which means more people have malaria. So these are the linkages that we study. Essentially, what I'm trying to tell you is increase in temperature will affect not only people's respiratory diseases directly, but it will also increase the number of people having malaria or dying from malaria. Okay. The other is, let's say, extreme temperature events, such as the 2007-2003 heat wave in Europe. We estimate that more than 200,000 people died from the heat wave alone in Europe. Let's talk about floods. One common measure or one common topic that climate deniers like to talk about, 100-year floods happen once every 100 years. What we now know and see is the 100-year flood now happens every other year. Actually, in some areas of the world, the 100-year flood happens every year. When there is a flood and you have stagnant water, you have diseases like cholera spreading like wildfire. I come from a country, it's still a poor country, Bangladesh, and we have frequent events, frequent flood events. As soon as there is flood, because floods usually take away safe drinking water source or safe sanitary conditions, cholera spreads. Cholera kills hundreds of thousands of people still every year. So erratic precipitation, increase in storms will continue to spread these diseases. Again, breaking this down, on the left you see climate change and the environmental condition. Social conditions, okay, direct exposures, and then you have indirect exposures. I'll come to all this. Health system conditions, health impacts. So let's talk about health infrastructure for a second. Italy, despite the fact that we have to wait for treatments for a long time, it still actually has one of the better functioning public health systems in the world. Okay? As climate change increases the incidence of diseases, more and more people will have to show up at hospitals. More and more people will have to be admitted in hospitals. Do you think the health infrastructure, the hospitals in and across the world are ready to deal with this? The simple answer is no, we are not. So this will not only be climate change will not only kill more people, it will also be a massive disaster for our health infrastructures across the world. So we have actually, that is the human beings, we have known that climate affects health long before people like me started studying this. Long time before, okay? Roman aristocrats retreated to hills or hill resorts each summer to avoid malaria. Rome was a bastion of malaria for a long, long time. It was built on a swamps, of course. Asians learned that during summer, strongly curried foods were less likely to cause diarrhea. Okay? So we have known this for a while. And the medical students will know about my last point. Hippocrates, in his Airs, Waters, and Places, said, whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. In the first place, to consider the seasons of the year. We talk a lot about seasonality now and the diseases it brings. And what effects each of them produces. We now know seasonality affects not only diseases but also things like crops, right? For they are not all the same, all alike, but differ much from themselves in regard to their changes. See, we already talked about seasonal changes in 400 BC, but because we are so bad at learning from history, we didn't care. We thought, oh, what does this old guy know? He's dead. He's been dead for 2,400 years, and so and so. We didn't learn anything. And now, well, we're dying faster. So, as I mentioned, climate change will have mostly, or the impacts of climate change can be broken down into direct and indirect impacts. The direct impacts relate to changes in frequency of extreme weather, such as heat, drought, heavy rain, or extreme precipitation events. The indirect impacts come through natural systems, such as vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue, waterborne diseases like typhoid, and of course air pollution. Both of them affect heavily our human systems, such as occupational impacts. I will talk about labor productivity today. We'll talk and malnutrition and mental stress. So mental stress is one of the topics that thus far have been understudied or under-investigated. So this is something people can look into, how climate change affects people's stress levels, mental stress or mental behavior. There is a lot of ongoing work on the impact of climate change on violent crimes. It has been shown that in some areas, extreme weather or especially extreme temperatures increases people's tendency to create violent crimes, including domestic violence. So I've broken down this lecture from now on into the main categories. So we'll first start off with temperature, go to waterborne diseases, floods and storms, and so on. So increases in global temperature will cause premature deaths. Okay? Temperature-related morbidity increases. So now we're talking about both mortality and morbidity, due to mostly through cardiovascular, respiratory, and kidney diseases. At high temperature levels, displacements of body or blood-body surface may lead to circulatory collapse. Both average and variability in temperature, so gradual change and let's say the standard deviation change, have critical influences on human health. Okay? Greater variability, day-to-day variability, month-to-month variability, annual variability, reduces survival chances, because our body, whether we like it or not, is an adaptive mechanism where we like to adapt. If climate changes too frequently, too fast, our body cannot adapt to it. Okay? Exposures to high minimum temperatures may reduce our ability to recover from high temperatures. As much as we hate sweating, sweating is how our body regulates our temperature. Okay? So if the minimum temperatures are increasing, okay, our body loses our ability to sweat and regulate the temperature, which is bad, because that's how we regulate when we have diseases like the flu. And I'm coming to this. So temperature and heat-related diseases. So the blue line is exposure, there is weighted exposure, and the red line is area weighted exposure. So one is weighted by population, the other is weighted by acreage or area. Okay? This chart shows mean summer warming relative to a base period of 1986 to 2008. The global mean temperature is calculated between these years, 1986 and 2008. So what this is showing us is that between 2000 and 2016, in 17 years, our exposure to warming was 0.9 degrees Celsius. Okay? This is more than double the global area average temperature rise during the same period. So globally, we were exposed to about 0.4 to 0.5 degrees. But as human beings, our exposure to warming was 0.9 degrees. So double what the Earth's surface felt. Okay? This is how dire the situation currently is. Now, rapid changes, so extreme weather events, okay, or even day-to-day changes, may also alter the balance between human and parasites. It increases the chance, so rapid events increases chances of new and resurgent diseases. Okay? So for example, in many areas, we eradicated malaria, but for the last, let's say, 7 or 8 years, more malaria occurrences are being found in areas that we thought, well, now we have controlled, free of malaria. We have seen dramatic increases in deaths during heat waves, resulting from both heat stroke and, of course, heat-related conditions, such as cardiovascular, respiratory, or cerebrovascular events. Both extreme cold and extreme hot temperatures have adverse impacts. So now we know that because now we see impacts of both extreme hot and extreme cold, we have figured out that there is a non-linearity of this relationship. I'm coming to this in a second. The human body maintains body temperature in ambient conditions, in let's say general conditions, not exceeding 32 degrees. Okay? If this is being tempered too rapidly, too frequently, then we as mankind are in trouble. Above this temperature, as many of you know, heat is lost through skin and sweating. Okay? So we lose our ability to regulate our own body temperature. Now, health effects of heat waves. Europe, for long considered sort of, protected from many of the climatic stressors, started thinking differently in mid-2000s, right? Because of the heat waves we had. Between 2000 and 2016, the number of vulnerable people to heat waves alone, so we're only talking about heat waves now, increased by 125 million. The population of Italy is 63 million. Think of it, double the population of Italy. A record 175 million people were exposed to heat waves in 2015. So 2015 was an exceptionally bad year. I still say exceptionally because now it's only 2018. But what my fear is, and what the climatologists tell us, is that years like 2015 will be more common going forward. So let's say approximately 200 million people will be exposed to extreme heat waves every year. And we can only imagine, we can now estimate the number of people that will die from heat waves. Okay. I've actually talked about this, a lot of this before. So let's go to the third point. In the heat wave of summer 2003 in Europe, more than 70,000 excess deaths were recorded. That was recorded in 2004. So over time, we know these deaths were actually almost 3 times as much, because many people died of complications later on. 70,000 people died within 1 year. Many people died from heat strokes related conditions within 2010. So milder winters. So you think milder winters are better for us, right? We have hotter temperatures to go to conditions, but it's actually not. Vulnerability to winter weather depends on housing, age, and baseline health. Okay? But the number of people that will die for extreme cold temperatures will actually not offset the number of people that die from extreme heat events in the summer. Just to give you an example, in the UK alone, we don't care about UK as much now. They're leaving the EU, but still human beings nonetheless. In the UK alone, heat-related deaths is expected to rise by 257%. Okay, from a baseline of about 2,000. So this is an older figure. What we expect now is in UK alone, where you have moderate summers because you have so much rain in UK, more than 10,000 people are expected to die in UK, an empire, one of the richest countries in the world, one of the best healthcare systems in the world, but even they will not be able to prevent the excess deaths. So, yeah, I'll talk about it. Okay. Increased air conditioning, improved social responses, and physical acclimatization. This is how we can moderate deaths from climate change or extreme heat events. The last two are good. Improved social responses and psychological acclimatization are good. But let's talk about air conditioning for a little bit. Air conditioning helps us regulate our indoor temperature, but increased use of air conditioning also increases pollution, which as a result increases the temperature delta, right? Heat-related mortality in Europe would increase by between 60,000 and 165,000 per year due to extreme heat events only. The highest impacts will come in southern Europe, including many parts of Italy, actually. The Australian hospital admissions, I'm jumping from country to country. The Australian hospital admissions for mental disorders, see I talked about extreme weather and violent events, right? Increased by 7.3% during heat waves above 27 degrees. 27 degrees is moderate temperature. Vulnerable population include the older adults and children, people working outdoors, especially in the agricultural sector, socially isolated and economically disadvantaged people, chronically ill people. So these are the most vulnerable population. And I will come to this in a little bit when we talk about managing the impacts. Again, I've talked about this. I'll skip this. This is US 209. Okay. So let's talk about labor capacity. Climate change, especially extreme weather, extreme temperature events, will have a great impact on how we work, even indoors. Okay. but it will have a especially profound impact on those working in manual labor or outdoor work or outdoor sectors in especially hot areas. Think about agricultural workers in Sicily. Rural labor capacity across the world is exposed to temperature estimated to, okay, so just rural capacity declined by more than 5% between 2000 and 2016. Look at the graph. It's on a downward trajectory. There is no stopping it. This is just rural conditions or where the temperatures are moderate. In urban conditions, this is even worse. So this is a paper I'm working on. I just submitted. This is on maximum temperature and working number of hours worked in South Africa. In agricultural sector, the optimal condition is 26.8, whereas more high-skilled workers, people working inside, the optimal temperature is 29.4. So as you can see, the nice shape where as temperature increases, your number of hours worked per week increases. But after the threshold, so here and here, there is a sharp decline, right? So again, this suits well with what we have talked about, nonlinear impacts, right? So there are optimal conditions where we work well, where we maximize our working capacity or our number of hours we work. You can call it labor productivity. But after that optimal condition is reached, any further increases in temperature brings about negative impacts. And this is common throughout all the sectors. This is just one country, South Africa. In South Africa, what we estimate is that under SSP3, which is regional rivalry, the socioeconomic pathways, output per capita in the agricultural sector will drop by 50%. Okay? That is, you're losing basically half your working capacity. There is a massive decline. And of course, you can say South Africa is a poor country. It doesn't have as much adaptation. But we also have evidence from Europe. So this is something I'm working on currently. This is impact of climate change on labor productivity in EU, the 28 member states conducted at the NUTS2 regions. So we have data from the 268 NUTS2 regions. Look at this. In the agricultural sector, the optimal condition is 8.4 degrees Celsius. In industry, more people working inside, the optimal condition is 13.2 degrees Celsius. In services, people like me working inside with computers, air conditioned, even then we have optimal condition of 21.7 degrees Celsius. Okay? So even here, even inside, we have an optimal working condition. But this is just historical impact. Let's see what happens if we put this together with future climate change. That is what we're interested in, right? Look at this. Most of Europe is blood red. And here I don't mean, the red of communism, but by here I mean is the red of impact of climate change. In this case, what we know now that by 2060, agricultural gross value added, which is our indicator for labor productivity in the agricultural sector, will decline by 8.2% by 2060. And in the industrial sector, the labor productivity will decline by 7.5%. Now, look at Europe. Europe has many cold regions. Sweden, Finland, Norway, extremely cold regions. But even considering them, the average labor productivity in Europe will decline by as much as 8%. 8% is huge for a developed region like Europe. So forget South Africa, where we're going to see 50% decline. In Europe itself, we're going to see 8% decline in labor productivity. And Europe is a bastion of improvements in adaptation capacities, even in the agricultural sector. This is how far climate change is already going to impact us, right? So we already have evidence, and we show this to the policymaker. They say, yes, we're thinking about this, but what we need is a push, right? So enough about temperature for a little bit. Let's move to waterborne diseases. Okay? Italy has the Po River Basin, which floods now every year. Okay? Floods bring in a whole new level of diseases that we thought we don't have to deal with it anymore. This affects the rural, urban, and agricultural runoff areas. In terms of exposure, this comes through contamination. And of course, water-carrying diseases like even dengue or typhoid. Okay? Cholera, of course, is the #1 killer. Let's look into this. Okay. So storms, the first thing it does, even in developed countries, it overwhelms treatment plants, water treatment plants. So we lose, even in the developed countries, we lose our access to clean drinking water. Now think of a third world country like Bangladesh, where your only source in rural areas to save drinking water might be a tube well, right? A manually pushed well where you get it. But what happens if it's contaminated? And what happens if you have lost your home, so you can't even boil water? You have no option but to drink whatever water you have. And that water is already contaminated. You are opening yourself up to cholera, right? And then that's just diseases. Include changes in ocean and coastal ecosystems brings about acidification, nutrient and contaminated runoff, increased salinity, and water security. So increased salinity in the water also sifts through the soil, right? So increased saline conditions, or the amount of soil land has, means that its optimal conditions for crops have already changed, right? So, and increased salinity also means that the crops now have less nutrients. So it's a multifaceted impact. You are being contaminated, your water is contaminated by diseases. Moving forward, your crops have less nutrients, right? And degradation of fresh water. The fishes are already contaminated. So this is a whole list of new problems that even developed countries will have to deal with going forward now. So let's talk about one, cholera outbreaks. Cholera outbreaks have been linked to variations in temperature, rainfall, and sea level increases for many, many years. Rotavirus infection, which is the virus actually associated with cholera, causes about 450,000 deaths in children younger than 5 years old in 2008. So 2008 was a especially bad year for cholera, but this now happens every year. Projected increase of 8 to 11% diarrhea risk by 2039. Okay, that's in 10 years' time, basically. Sorry, 20 years' time. Runoff from more frequent and intense extreme precipitation will be more common. You don't even have to look far. I said, Po River Basin floods every year now. Rivers in Bangladesh floods every year, actually more than once a year. Increases in extreme events and storms will increase the risk on infrastructure also. We lose our access to drinking water. Wastewater plants are affected, and stormwaters are increasingly common. Okay, now I talked about waterborne diseases. Now let's talk about airborne diseases a little bit. Of course, climate change affects the production, allergenicity, distribution, and timing of allergens. Okay, impact of household to air pollution, especially to cooking and ambient pollution. So in Europe, we don't have the cooking oils problem, right? But in countries like Bangladesh, especially in the rural areas, what you cook with, whether be it wood or kerosene, which is not a clean fuel, affects your health because you are right there. You're cooking inside your home with an unclean fuel or a fuel that is very polluting, right? This will cause 6.8 million premature deaths annually. So 6.8 million additional people will die from ambient air pollution or from pollution caused by what they're cooking with. Okay? About 150,000 premature deaths can be attributed to ozone pollutants alone. Okay? 190 million lost disability adjusted life years. So this is the DALY. So this is one of the indicators that we use as economists or health economists to measure people's ability lost. Okay, so it's called DALY, the disability adjusted life years. Okay, what we estimate is that approximately 7.5% of our life years will be lost due to air pollution alone. And this is not considering the people that will die early. This is just what we are losing. So Delhi, in one of the biggest cities in India, has such bad fog that the government is installing massive fans to deal with fogs. I mean, that's how bad the situation is, right? So we don't even know how to deal with this anymore. We've come up with solutions like fans, okay, in highways, whereas the solution should be in the source. We should really be trying to reduce the sources of pollution. We're not, we're trying to mitigate. So now I've just talked about deaths, but there is an economic cost. We estimate that the economic cost of premature deaths from air pollution in Europe only is $1.43 trillion. Okay, so this is approximately now 1.25 or 1.23 trillion euros. The overall annual economic cost, including estimates for morbidity, stands at $1.57 trillion. Okay, 4,000 additional premature deaths due to increased exposure to the PM 2.5. 1,500 additional ozone-associated deaths by 2020 in the UK. Prevalence of asthma in South Africa will increase substantially. By substantially, I mean more than 10% by 2050. Under a maximum feasible CO2 reduction, 460,000 premature deaths could be avoided. But we're actually long beyond that point. So this A2 is approximately RCP 2.6. We're beyond 2.6. So we're actually beyond the best case scenario. We're now talking about a 2 degree, keeping it below 2 degrees Celsius, right? We're even failing at that. Actually, even Europe, with the best mitigation and adaptation plans in the world, even most European countries are unable to meet the Paris Agreement requirements. So we have talked about temperature, we have talked about waterborne diseases, we have talked about airborne diseases. Now let's talk about vector-borne diseases. Vector-borne diseases are diseases such as those carried by mosquitoes or ticks. So let's say malaria, dengue. Okay? Rome, being built on marshlands or swamps, okay, was a bastion, as I said, of malaria. Thousands of people that actually died from other diseases actually died of malaria, because even with plague and malaria, they are very common. The first symptoms. 2 years ago, about 60 kilometers from Rome, archaeologists found a very old graveyard where people buried were marked as they died from plague. Now, with advanced post-mortem or post-mortem technology, they found that people had died actually from malaria. Malaria is a very old killer that most of the developed world thought we had gotten rid of. It's going to come back, and it's going to come back stronger than ever. It might be a new strain that we have never seen before. I'll come to one malaria fact very soon. So here it is. Influence of malaria is nonlinear. Okay? Temperature affects the incubation period of malaria vectors along with the lifespan. So mosquitoes, as you hate them, as much as we hate them, are going to live for longer with warming scenarios. Okay? Rainfall, now we have more erratic rainfall, which leads to stagnant water, is critical for breeding of mosquitoes. So this is a paper I recently published in the International Journal of Hygiene and Environmental Health, where I estimate the burden of climate change on malaria mortality. Okay? Let me tell you what we find. Malaria currently is present in 105 countries. Okay? Between 1980 and 2010, okay? So my paper deals with 1980 and 2010. In 2016, approximately 445,000 people died from malaria. Okay? Whereas there were 216 million cases of malaria. 70% of the deaths we know occurred in children less than 5 years old. I find a nonlinear relationship. What I find is a global optimal temperature beyond which all-age malaria mortality increases is approximately 21 degrees Celsius. So essentially what I find is as temperature increases beyond the 21 degree globally, you are going to see a spike in malaria mortality. Okay? The optimal conditions are 28.4 and 26.3 in Africa and Asia respectively. So in Africa and Asia are the continents with most malaria mortality. So this is what I was talking about. As you can see, as temperature increases initially, from the low to high, about 21 degrees, you see a decline. But beyond 21, we see a high spike. So beyond 21 degrees, we're going to see more and more deaths. So again, I combine the estimates with future data. With unmitigated climate change, so RCP 8.5, it's approximately 4-degree increase in global temperature, by the end of the 21st century, okay, all-age malaria mortality will increase by 2.5%, whereas child malaria mortality will increase by 11.4% on average, but in some areas it will increase by 20%. So a 20% increase in children malaria mortality. That is huge. Okay, you just think of this, and this is only going, because this is based on countries that currently have malaria mortality, 105 countries. Going forward, many more countries will have malaria, so these numbers will only increase. More vector-borne disease facts. 390 million dengue infections worldwide. Roughly 96 million manifest with symptoms. Okay? Actually, Spain has had some dengue conditions recently. In Dhaka, the city where I come from, hospital admissions due to dengue increased with both high and low river levels. Okay? So both high and low levels of river conditions affected hospital admissions. Projections. Okay, here's a good number for us. In 2050, so mid-century, approximately almost 2 billion people will be at risk to malaria. Okay, 200 million more than if the disease control efforts were not opposed by climate change. Every year we spend billions of dollars on battling malaria, but this battle is considered a losing battle because of climate change now. Climate change vector malaria linkage may become more significant, as I just mentioned, resulting in more than 660,000 deaths. So that 20% number I mentioned for child malaria mortality, that's what it means, 660,000 deaths. It's a huge number that I'm just throwing out because this is something that has become common to us. Millions of deaths. We now measure deaths in millions. That's how bad we have become. It doesn't baffle us anymore. I mean, 1 million deaths, we should hang our heads in shame. But I'm talking like this, it's like, nothing, because I know this is what is common now. Global trends, again, just some very nice graphs that I thought. So this shows the incidences of climate-sensitive diseases only. As you can see, the top one is interesting because climate-sensitive disease incidences are on the rise. I'll come to this here. Everywhere, global increase in vectorial capacity, the capacity that causes diseases such as malaria and dengue and are rising by between 3% to 6%, okay, to 1990 levels. If we compare it to 1950s, it's rising by more than 10% in some areas. That's how bad the situation is. The vectorial capacities are increasing, which means deaths will only increase. So those were direct impacts to do with the human body. I mentioned that climate change is affecting the nutrient quality or the nutrients in food. I have a PhD student now who's going through an Ugandan data set which tells us what people ate in a given week. She is now converting that data, what people ate, into kilocalories. So we're going to study how climate change has affected calorie intake per person in a given week in Uganda. We're going to investigate if climate change is an effect. And then we're going to use that to look into if what you are eating, how it affects your labor capacity. Okay? This is the type of studies that we'll be doing in the future, very micro level, looking at human condition, the heterogeneity in human behavior. Coming back, climate change may reduce both the quantity and the quality of food harvested, as I mentioned. We know that it is a threat to crop yields across the world. Human exposure to chemical contaminants in food will increase. Sea surface temperature, floods, extreme weather events such as storms will not only destroy quantity of plants or crops, but also the quality. There are now studies which show climate change is affecting the nutrient capacity in crops, which in effect is affecting how children's brains developed. Okay? So there is already a direct effect in human beings from climate change. Here are some nice numbers again. By 2050, climate change will lead, this is per capita reduction, 3.2% in global food availability, 4% in fruit and vegetable consumption, 0.7% decline in red meat consumption. These changes can be associated with about 530,000 additional deaths worldwide. So this is in addition to the 660,000 people that will die from malaria, in addition to more than 1 million that will die from extreme weather events. So we add up, some entire countries will be gone not just due to storms or sea level rise, but there will be no one living there. Everyone will be dead, right? Again, natural disasters. Coastal populations are more vulnerable to health impacts from coastal flooding. I come from a country with long coastal events, long coastal areas, where people every year move inland because their homes have been taken over or taken away by river erosion. And this is going to be more and more common going into the 21st century. Extreme events also causes disruption of infrastructure, including power, water, transportation, and communication systems, which are essential to maintain access. Think if there is a power plant failure in a region with one hospital. Okay? If the hospital loses its access to electricity, none of the life support machines will be working. People will die instantly. And this is becoming more and more common, not only in the developed countries, not only in the developing countries, but also in the developed worlds. Floods are the primary health hazards, as I mentioned, from extreme precipitation events, but along with hurricanes and storms. Flood spreads waterborne diseases, as we know. I already talked about diarrhea and tuberculosis, right? So I'll skip this because this is mostly, okay, here we go. Most of the world will be exposed to flooding events resulting from the climate change going into the 21st century. Most of the world. This is showing incidence of diseases or waterborne diseases due to increases in floods. Even the most optimistic situation means millions more dying by the end of the century. Okay. If heat waves increase in frequency and intensity, risk of deaths and serious illnesses would increase. Remember the vulnerable population I talked about in the beginning? Older age group, people with pre-existing conditions with cardiorespiratory diseases, and the urban poor. By 2030, 70% of the world's population will be living in urban areas. The poor urban areas, such as slums in third world countries, third world cities like Dhaka, are hotbeds of diseases, hotbeds of poor education, poor hygiene. Those people will die of endemics. You need one incident of cholera. Hundreds will die instantly, overnight. It will be like a plague in Veneto. Effects would be exacerbated by increased humidity and urban air pollution. Greatest increases in thermal stress are forecasted for mid to high latitude cities, right? Especially in populations with unadapted architecture, like cities such as Dhaka, cities such as Delhi, where you have unplanned infrastructure, unplanned growth, right? Which limits air conditioning. Cities in Europe are increasingly trying to build greenery into urban infrastructure. But cities in the third world countries cannot do so. We simply do not have the funds, which means increase in temperature delta and increase in deaths. Population of concern. I want to go into a detail about this because I need you to take this message away from today. The very old and the very young, we already talked about them. Socially vulnerable people are also at greater risk. For example, race and ethnicity are powerful markers of health status and social disadvantage. People who are minorities across the world usually suffer more from events such as extreme climatic events. Okay? Poorest countries and regions are more susceptible. Urban heat islands, aging population, increased urbanization, all three are common across the world now. These are projected to increase both vulnerability and urban populations to heat-related events, heat-related health impacts that I talked about in the beginning of the lecture. Current climatic stressors, such as droughts and floods, will be amplified in the sub-Saharan Africa, which is already poor. Under climate change, sparse infrastructure and high dependence on natural resources will only worsen. Okay? Asia and the Pacific have large populations living in low-lying areas prone to flooding, such as Bangladesh, such as Thailand, such as Philippines. Some of the most beautiful places in the world are low-lying areas. They are also very prone to flooding. What that means is they're also prone to increased number of deaths going to the future. So I'm almost done with this. How do we manage this? How do we manage the impacts of climate change? This has to be an impact that has to be managed together. Economists cannot do it. The medical profession itself cannot do it. Engineers will be able to help, but they cannot do it by themselves. politicians need to pitch in. So that it has to be a combined effort. Okay? But tackling climate change could be also one of the greatest health opportunities of the 21st century. Yes, this will put unprecedented pressure on public health infrastructure, but this will also allow us to adapt. This will also allow us to change our track. Okay? The global health community has a vital role to play. That includes you, the medical professionals, or the future medical professionals. We need to improve our public health infrastructures. We need to improve how we communicate the risks of public health to the people, to the general population. We need increased collaboration between the sectors, between the private sectors, the public sectors. Okay? Overall, we need to strengthen the health systems with a priority. It cannot be one of the areas that gets left over of social funding. It must be a priority when the governments and the policymakers are budgeting. Okay? And the links between climate change and global health must be communicated to the general public. And this means you. Beginning in October, the middle of October, we had a conference in Venice where we invited 600 high school teachers to teach them how to communicate impacts of climate change to their students. Those are the type of events that need to occur more and more. And I hope what I talked to you about today, you will take at least some of it away. Talk to people, okay? Talk to your community, because they really need to know. Maybe one person will change their behavior. One person will regulate their transportation we use. One person will change the way they use the air conditioning in home, right? One person at a time. That's all we need. So what people like me try to do, we try to map vulnerability. This leads to early warning systems. We need to tell the policymakers, we need to public health professionals to provide them early warnings where the next risk or the next climatic risk might be happening. Okay? This prevents negative impacts through altering health authorities and the public, right? This is how we anticipate climate impacts and vulnerability assessments. So through the maps I showed you, now we know the areas in Europe that in 20 years' time will become really vulnerable to climate change. So those areas hopefully will start to adapt more. Maybe more money will be funneled to them to build climate resilient infrastructure, climate resilient health infrastructure, hopefully. Assessing the public health interventions. In Europe, even in Europe, we need to have a major assessment of how the public health infrastructure deals with climatic events. Okay? This will help us to develop and implement health adaptation plans. Most countries in the EU don't even have a health adaptation plan now. We have general adaptation plans, but not a health adaptation plan itself. We need to evaluate the impacts and improve quality of our activities in general, not just among academics, but in general. Okay? So these are very general events. So far, what I have told you is the impact of climate change will be uneven, spatially and temporally. Across the world, there will be a lot of heterogeneity of impacts of climate change, direct and indirect, but also across time. Some impacts will increase exponentially over time. Okay? We have robust scientific findings, but even us, people like me, have to improve how we communicate. We are horrible at communicating our research. Most of our research is published and then forgotten about. We need to find out a way how to communicate these maps to the policymakers in areas that will be more vulnerable going into the 21st century. Of course, big data, engineers will know. Now we create data by the minute. Okay? We need to understand, hopefully some of you will go into this, use big data to understand how climate change affects your sector, right? How climate change affects the medical profession, for example, hospital admissions, how climate change will affect how you build climate resilient infrastructure in the future. All these are very important in our effort to tackle climate change. So I'm almost done, 2 more slides. The major takeaways, what I really want you to take away from my 1-hour ramble is that certain groups have higher susceptibility to climate change. The impact of climate change, especially on health, will not be consistent. It will be very heterogeneous. Okay? The very old and the very young, women, especially pregnant women, people that are socially marginalized, minorities, both in terms of race and in terms of, let's say, ethnicity, are especially vulnerable. The socioeconomic costs of health problems caused by climate change to these people are considerable. Takeaway 2. Many infectious diseases, including waterborne ones, are highly sensitive to climatic conditions. Many of these diseases will come back. We call them re-emergence of diseases. Malaria will come back to countries like Italy. Okay? And developing countries will be there will be an increased geographical spread of diseases such as diarrhea, which kills hundreds of thousands every year in developing countries. With that, I'm done. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, or even comments, or general, anything. Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking.
Yes.
The pollution, the health problems
Mm-hmm.
related to the use of air conditioning.
Yeah.
Is related to the production of power.
One, yes.
Well, so it depends on how you produce power.
One, yes, but remember, most air conditions also, it sucks out the warm air out of your home and pushes it out into the atmosphere, right? So it's a dual effect. It increases your electricity consumption, right? So I just did a study. I need to tell you this. I just mapped with one of my colleagues the electricity generation in Europe. Out of the 268 regions, 273, but 5 are in island regions. Out of the 268 NUTS2 regions in the European continent, 39 NUTS2 regions still produce nuclear power. Okay, 39, that's more than 15%, right? So this is how it is going to affect hydro in Italy. So let's say Valle d'Aosta, these regions, they rely a lot on hydropower for electricity access. So we're increasing your electricity demand. It means there is a pressure on the source itself, right? Hydropower means more hydropower means you are drawing more water out, right? So the dual impact, that's a very good question. One, you're using more electricity, but two, you're also increasing the temperature outside, right? Yes?
In your opinion, what is the main goal the broad part of populations should achieve right now?
Okay, that's a very good question, very loaded question. So I'll answer it in two parts. One for the general public, right? Let's say for people like us, we live in urban areas, right? So one could be the way we go on with our day-to-day lives, right? Reduce individual transportation, right? Use more public transportation. Use more bicycles maybe, right? Two is how we, let's say, how we engage with the policymakers. People in our age group, including myself, we are very bad with voting, right? We need to show up at the voting booths, vote for people that at least have some sense of climatic change, right? That going forward is very important. But there is another one. More and more people like you can be directly engaged. Get engaged with your local community. Get engaged with institutions like CMCC. We do a lot of climate outreach events. In general, pay attention, but get engaged. That's the goal to people like you from me. Questions? Anything? Yes, please.
I have two questions.
Yes.
So the first one is, did you account for immigration in your data when you were talking about the number of deaths? Because we're expecting waves of climate refugees that are going to amass in refugee camps.
Yes.
Is that going to affect that?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, as temperatures increase, there is going to be like feedback loops that
Absolutely.
start. So what I was thinking is, isn't it kind of hopeless to plan after a certain point? We've already reached a certain point. Isn't there going to be like societal collapse after a certain point that we should account for?
Yes, so those are very good questions. The first one with migration, right? So I didn't present today because I didn't think I would have time. So we are finishing a paper where we computed the impact of climate change on migration. What we estimated is by 2070, approximately 3.5% of the total population, the total global population, will migrate due to climate change. Okay? So to answer your first question, we cannot actually take into account migration into the estimates we have produced. That's a separate issue, but we are dealing with it. And that's a very important question because people like me, I'm a migrant, right? I like to think I brought in my human capital. So there are two parts to human capital, the good human capital. So I brought in my education with me, but also unfortunately, migrants also bring in the diseases they might have, right? So diseases, your health travels with you. Okay, as bad as it sounds, this is something we have to increasingly be aware of, right? So this is one way of disease travels from country to country through human beings. So that's a very good question, not only because climate will result in climate refugees or environmental migrants as we call it, but also it will rapidly increase some of the diseases through human beings themselves. Question number 2, what you're talking about are tipping points or social collapse. Yes, there will be social collapse. So what I showed you, the optimal conditions, right, with agriculture, industry, and manufacturing and services, those are climatic tipping points, right? We also do a lot of research with social tipping points, where we're trying to estimate where the society will be on the brink of collapse, right? I will not call it hopeless because we're trying to estimate at the point where this collapse might happen, right? This will be an early warning system. We're going to try to use this as a warning to the people, to the policymakers, so that we don't reach that point. Okay? Despite the fact that I'm an economist and I study dismal science, I have enough faith in humanity so that I think we will not reach that point. But unfortunately, we have reached that point in some areas, right? There is ample research that shows that climate change is increasing conflicts across the world, right? So those are all already social tipping points happening, right? And this will be more and more common. Think all the things I've talked about, agriculture, water, these are directly linked with, these are resources, these are natural resources, and these are directly linked with people, how people interact with each other. As water becomes more and more scarce, more and more conflicts will happen, especially in countries like in countries in Africa. Water availability is a great determinant of conflicts, and as you said, as this becomes more problematic, we are likely to see more conflicts. The only way to ensure this is we don't reach those tipping points. But unfortunately, we have thousands of tipping points. There is no one single global tipping point, right? We have a tipping point in every region. So this is why people like you are so important. We need to take this back to our communities, engage with our communities so that there is no community collapse, right? Thank you for your question. That's very good. Please keep going. Yes?
I don't know if I didn't understand well.
Okay.
Talking about the increasing of temperature, is that the perception of human being is double of in spite of the real increasing of temperature, or I didn't understand well?
Yes. So let me break this down a little bit. One we weighted by the area of the Earth, right? And the other one was weighted by the human population. So the Earth experienced about 0.5 degree increase, whereas humans experience 0.9 degrees. So part of it is perception, but the perception comes from measurements, right? So whatever the Earth felt, we as human beings, because we are not as adaptive as our adaptive mechanism is not as good as the planet itself, was double, right? So again, very good question. Yes. Yes.
First, let me thank you for your presentation. It's like a lot of information and still need to process it. I just have a curiosity. Are there any differences in the impacts we might expect in the future on the private health systems in respect to public health systems?
Very good question. Yes, we do expect it because private health systems are more equipped, to deal with the crises because you pay into it more, right? And because not the whole population uses it, it has less stress on itself, right? And whether we like it or not, private health systems are catered for the rich, right? Whereas the public health infrastructure are poorly funded across the world, right? They have greater stresses on themselves, especially the ER, pronto soccorso departments across the world, right? So to answer your question, there is major difference, a lot of heterogeneity. Public health systems are very poorly equipped to deal with the disaster of climate change, especially on the human system that is coming, unfortunately.
But in private systems, I think there will be more isolated people and socially exclusion.
Yes, that is true. But again, because they're private, right, they have a different mechanism to deal with it. They don't rely on public insurance, right? So you pay, if you want private insurance or private healthcare, you pay a lot, right? And then you have, because it's the private sector, they do not take into account merit goods, right? So health is essentially underconsumed. Yes, keep going. Questions, comments? Yes, sorry, I didn't see you.
So as we expect many more diseases to spread, we're going to have more pathogens.
Yes.
So the national healthcare system is going to need to use more antibiotics.
Yes.
Yeah. Resistance are going to spread with this pathogen. Do you have any data about the increase of antibiotic resistance and spreading among bacteria?
We do, yes, we do, but in pockets of the world. So what he's trying to say, and it's a very, very good point. So over the last many, many years, we have been consuming more and more antibiotics, right? It's a good thing because we have managed to cure or not die from many diseases, but the bad side is we have become more resilient to these antibiotics. So every time you have an antibiotics course, your resilience to that increases, so you need to take a greater course next time. So there is now data that shows our resilience to some antibiotics are so high that the pathogens themselves has taken over the resilience. So those are the issues that we call the super diseases or the super bugs, right? Bugs or carriers that are essentially immune to our current antibiotics. So send me an email and I'll be happy to send you some papers. And that's a very good question. The issue of superbugs, super diseases that we simply don't know. Well, actually, we know how to cure, but we can't find out the cure because we have become so resilient, so adaptive to these pathogens. Yes?
So like most of the diseases that you mentioned, they are actually curable diseases.
Yes.
So like, yeah, we have medication,
Mhm.
at least here in Europe,
Yes.
let's say. But in many parts of what I thought about is people die from malaria, typhoid, tuberculosis.
Yes.
But because they don't have the access in many cases in the third world.
True.
That's so when we say people die from malaria, in my mind I am like, yes, people die from malaria because they do not have the access to healthcare systems, to the medication. So I think what underlines these deaths and the loss of lives is the systemic and infrastructural vulnerabilities of those people. So here in Europe, I think we have quite good adaptive and coping capacity in this case, even though our systems may not be able to handle it very well. But I think in some years we will be able. But how about people in those areas? Because my specialization is climate change impacts in Uganda as well.
Good.
Been there, seen there. So when I have seen those, when we talk about this stuff in Europe, to me, it seems like, yes, I know, but when I have seen those conditions, these are so far away to me. Like,
So those are very good points. So what we talk about, or what I talked about today, are additional deaths, right? So these are in addition to the systemic underachievements or systemic issues that are already ongoing in the third world countries. For example, I'll give you I'll talk about Bangladesh because I know the healthcare system well. So in Bangladesh, we have mandatory cholera vaccination, right? These are mandatory in the coastal regions. So everyone in those regions gets a cholera vaccination, right? But what we see with climate change is, because the issues are being exacerbated, the populations that used to be not vulnerable to cholera are now vulnerable to cholera. So yes, part of it is attributed to the systemic issues, but going forward, most of it is going to be attributed to climate change because we know the systemic issues. We sort of know how to deal with them. We know where our deficiencies are, but we don't know how much of the systemic issues will get worse due to climate change. Mention the case of Uganda, excellent example. Coming back to Europe, yes, in Europe, we have much better coping mechanism, much better healthcare system, but think of Italy. We do have the coping mechanism, but do we have the coping mechanism to malaria, having not dealt with malaria for more than 4 decades? That's the question we're trying to answer, right?
Yeah.
We have.
Know the Italian system. Sorry, I'm not Italian. So
no. So no, but even we talk about the many European countries, right? Yes, you have great points. We are more resilient. We have more funding, more resources to deal with it, right? But where Europe will suffer is with the reemergence of diseases that it thought it had cured, that it thought it had gotten rid of. The issues in the third world countries are much, much worse, right? There we're still trying to get vaccination to people. So climate change obviously sometimes will have to take a back seat, right? But if we can communicate that climate change will worsen, multiply the systemic issues that we're already having in the third world countries, only then we'll be able to deal with effectively, right? Very good question again. Yes?
Earlier you showed us a lot of different data about the increasing diseases and number of deaths that may happen throughout all the different years, and by 2050 you said that there will be a lot of deaths.
Yes.
There will be more deaths nowadays. You also said that in the last 60 years the medical evolution has been really high. So aren't we ignoring the part of the medical evolution and maybe prevention against these certain diseases?
Excellent question. So I won't say we're ignoring. That's what I'm banking on. That's where I put my faith on, that medical technology will improve or continue to improve at the rate which it has, so in the last 60 years, right? But the problem will be if the climate-induced medical issues, deaths, morbidity, mortality, right, increase at a faster rate than the medical technology can keep up with, right? So now we talked about the superbug, antibiotic resistance. We talked about systemic issues in third world countries in the public health sector. So, and then we talked about, and then there is the climate change issue. So all three of this versus the medical sector, I put my faith on the medical sector to come up with solutions. Let's not say medical sector, but the public health sector, which includes the medical technology field, to come up with solutions and adaptation mechanisms going forward to deal with these issues, right? Yes, we hope so. And there is the trend which tells us it will. But the problem is, if those improvements only happen in the developed countries, right, then we are leaving the rest of the world to deal with more problems than it can deal with, right? So yes, of course, medical technology will improve, but problem is, if there is a massive flood affecting 1 million people, there is only so much the medical field can do, right? So it's not just the technology itself, not just the antibiotics, not just the medicine, but you need to actually send people out there to deal with it, right? Medical professionals. Yes, please.
We have said that there are at risk social and economical disadvantaged
Yes.
groups. So my question is, how climate change will impact on inequalities inside society, even in developed societies? Because if it impacts inequalities, we will be inside those groups.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I wish I had more time. So even in developed countries, because climate change affects or has greater impacts on sectors such as agriculture, where you have more low-income people working, right? So we already know that the impact on the low-income sectors are more, right? So people that are already in the low-income brackets are going to suffer more than the rich already. So this is already an increase in inequality. Okay, I have a research which shows the Gini coefficient by which we measure inequality will increase from 0.3 currently to 0.4 by the end of the 21st century. So this is essentially saying an increase of inequality by 30%. Okay. In the developed world, this increase in inequality will be about 10 to 12%. Okay, so I think that's what you're asking. Climate change will affect inequality, income inequality, social inequality, which essentially means that the people who are already disadvantaged economically, socially, and they're marginalized will suffer even more due to climate change. Questions, comments?
There's no one else.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So you said that you're working on communicating better.
Yes.
We're all working on communicating better. And when we communicate to other people about climate change, what should we do? What should we be working on to get the point across?
Okay, it's a very good question. Excellent question. So what we need to focus on, so she asked, I talked a lot about communication better. Economists by nature are horrible communicators or horrible in communication. So when you communicate climate change, issue number one, it affects everyone. Okay, it's not only it won't only affect the poor farmer in rural Bangladesh. It will affect everyone. Okay, two, it's not just temperature. It's temperature, precipitation, extreme climatic events such as storms and floods, okay, or even droughts. Okay, that's issue number two. Three, it affects all areas of our life, from our work to our society, the way we act with the environment, the way we act with nature. Okay. Four, solutions are available. Okay, it is not a doom and gloom scenario. Okay, that might throw some people off. So solutions are available, and the solutions are within reach. But to do so, to reach the solutions or to get the solutions, we need to act together. Okay, the society, the policymakers, the students, everyone. Number five, everyone can contribute. That is probably the most important issue, right? Tell your friends not to use plastic straws, right? Not to use disposable plastic bags when you go grocery shopping, okay? To use public transport, to walk an extra mile, to use a bicycle, right? To not abuse antibiotics, even if they're within reach, right? Maybe reduce red meat consumption, okay? Get engaged to your policymakers, your local level policymaker, okay? Tell them that you are passionate about this issue. Go to the festas that happen all across Italy throughout the year. Talk to them. Come up with climate clubs. Attend climathons in CMCC. All these solutions, and these are actually very simple solutions, right? That we can all contribute to ourselves will help contribute better. Generally, just talk to people about climate change. Many people simply think this is something only the experts talk about, and therein lies the problem. It affects everyone, so everyone should be talking about it. Just talk to someone who hasn't talked about it, hasn't cared about it. Mention one thing, and that's one person who might change their view, right? Yes?
You didn't mention wildfires.
Yes, I did not, because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it is outside my area of expertise. But this year, we have seen what possibly is the worst cases or incidences of wildfires across Europe. Right now we are having them in California, but Portugal has been ravaged by wildfire. So wildfire, essentially, it destroys the land, destroys forestry, right, and kills people directly. But indirectly, wildfire causes a lot of air pollution, which has long-lasting effects on respiratory diseases, on cardiovascular diseases. And because it hangs, smoke from wildfire hangs in the air for such a long time, these impacts are long-lasting. Okay? Yes, that's one. It's very good. Thank you for pointing that out. But the wildfire impacts are relatively new to us, the health impacts. We're just starting to estimate them. We saw them more of a forestry problem so far, but now we know that there are long-lasting health impacts also. Very good. Yes?
Is it true that a vegan or vegetarian diet is better for climate change, for health?
As a carnivorous who eats everything, let me answer it this way. We need to reduce our red meat consumption because that's where a significant part of our greenhouse gas emissions come from, right? So I'm not going to be a high priest and say you should not eat meat at all. What I will tell you is that we can work on reducing our consumption, right? If we reduce our consumption of red meat, it gives a signal to the red meat suppliers not to produce as much, not to kill as much, not to invest as much in red meat production, right? Whether a vegan or a vegetarian diet is better, I think if we look at it unilaterally, yes, in the sense that they produce less pollution, okay, or they contribute less to the greenhouse gas emissions, right? But I think this will come in gradually. A Mediterranean diet, a person who is used to Mediterranean diet will not wake up overnight and be able to say, or our entire community will not be able to completely eradicate its red meat consumption, right? But if we can reduce it gradually, I believe there will come at a time where we probably won't even think about it, right? It will become natural to us. But yes, so the signal needs to come from us to begin with. Yes?
Comparatively to social collapse, is there, can we imagine about the soil improvement and the collapse of soil relatively to the agriculture and production of food and soil nutrition?
Yes, again, excellent question. So he's talking about soil eradication, land use change, right? So there is a lot of research on land use change which shows that due to climate change, salinity of arable land is increasing, or land is simply being submerged underwater for such a long time during a year that we cannot grow crops there anymore, right? So yes, the soil collapse will probably come much later because the earth is so good at adapting to changing circumstances, but there will come at times when it no longer can adapt to the changing conditions. If the changes are too frequent, too rapid, too intense, then it will come at a time. For example, we just talked about forest fires. After forest fires, it takes decades for the soil to go back to its original arable condition, right? And so in countries like Bangladesh, where we have known about salinity due to river erosion for a very long time, we have switched to what we call climate resilient crops. So these are crops that can grow in high salinity conditions, right? But what we are seeing now is even those crops are losing resilience because the soil degradation has gone over its threshold or its collapse threshold, right? Yes.
It may sound evil, okay, don't get me wrong, but how many of those deaths, climate change related deaths and stuff like that, can be prevented by birth control? Is there any study about this?
So before I even try answering your question, climate change has already led to decreasing fertility. Okay, so number of babies born per year is actually declining due to climate change. Two reasons. One, it's hot. If it's hot, people simply have less sex. It's a fact. Two, the male sperm actually survives for less length of time at warmer temperatures, right? So this is the effect that is happening. To answer your question, I don't know of an exact figure that might say how many of those could have been prevented, but I suspect many, right? Especially in the developing countries, many of those excess population are due to birth control or due to the lack of access to birth control, right? So yes, yeah, many. Yes.
May I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Your journey from Bangladesh to Italy.
So it's been a long journey. So I finished my high school in Bangladesh in 2006, then went to the US for my Laurea. I studied in Oklahoma. It's backward US. Lots of uber racist people. But that was in 2006 to 2010. I have a double undergraduate in economics and mathematics. And then I moved to New Hampshire for my magistrale, much more developed, much more civilized people, but much colder. So I did my magistrale in economics, then I went back home for 1 year, got married, worked for the World Bank, absolutely hated it. Then I decided to apply for a PhD, and I found out that the program in Venice is one of the very few that specializes in climate change impacts. So I moved to Venice in 2012, finished the PhD in February 2016, and by then I had already been working with CMCC and Ca' Foscari. So that's my round the world journey. Yes?
The main responsible of climate change are the big industries and their consumers. Are there some sustainable energy sources that can replace the actual ones without stop the system
Collapse? Yes, absolutely. So the question is with energy. So many of the energy sources supply is highly polluting and highly draining on our natural resources, especially let's say coal, fossil fuel, hydro, right? Many countries are switching to renewables such as solar and wind, right? And there have already been instances where solar and wind production have been so high. I can give you examples of UK over the summer because it was so hot. The solar energy production was so high that the electricity producers actually had to pay the consumers to use electricity, right? And I think the same will happen with wind if more and more people follow the example of Netherlands and establish or install windmills, right, to produce electricity. So yes, I can envision a time where maybe fossil fuel powered electricity will not completely go away, but it will become a very small part of electricity production, where we will switch mostly to, let's say, solar, wind, geothermal. For example, Toscana, the region of Toscana, produces almost 60% of its electricity production from geothermal energy, right? More than 60%. So this is where we are going. Iceland produces more than 100% of its electricity requirements from geothermal, but that's a very specific example of from Iceland. But solar and wind are available everywhere, essentially, right? We just need to harness the power of nature to meet our needs. But again, very good question. It won't collapse because the system will have to adapt, right?
We are working on it as energy engineering.
Oh, excellent, you know? Yeah. Yes?
Is capitalism linked to climate change?
Yes.
And if so,
Yes.
should we think changing about should change our economic system?
Yes, absolutely. think of the Nobel Prize in economics. The Nobel Prize in economics, for the first time, we went to an economist who works with climate change primarily, Professor Nordhaus. If you want an answer to your question and a one-sentence explanation of this year's climate change and economic sciences is this: the markets, which is the foundation of capitalism, if the markets are left alone, okay, so unchecked capitalism, it will produce too much pollution, okay, which is climate change. Also, if the markets, or hence capitalism, are left alone, it will produce too few ideas, the innovation, okay. Innovation must be spurred on, innovation must be invested on. That is what Professor Nordhaus got his Nobel Prize for, right? Endogenous growth theory, that the government has a lot to contribute to in order to promote innovation. So the answer to your question is yes, capitalism is one of the biggest causes of our systematic collapse, because capitalism does not take into consideration the natural resources draining. Like we talk, as an economist, the worst indicator in the history of mankind we came up with is the GDP, right? We measure how rich a country is by its GDP, how big its GDP is, but the GDP does not penalize a country for using up its natural resources, right? So, yes. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.